Yeah, well, I first want to start, Dr. Sean Evans. Thank you so much. You're so gracious with your time and helping us out. So I really appreciate you making time for us.
Well, thank you for having me on the podcast, and I appreciate all that you are doing to try to reduce the vitriol in our political discourse. As we potentially saw yesterday, uh, that vitriol might have cost Charlie Kirk his life. And when we see things like this, what we have to remember that if it was politically motivated, this is not just a crime against the state. This is a crime against democracy. Because in democracies, we resolve our conflicts with ballots and not bullets. And potentially someone has decided that um, Charlie Cook and potentially his ideas are not worth being heard. And so that is a problem. And I think that's something that you're trying to do something about, and I commend you for that.
Yeah, well, thank you, and thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, I think we underestimate the power of some of this language we use. I pay attention to a lot of these kind of trends that come up, and you see, partisan media jumping on.
Yeah.
We're gonna demonize this person this week, and whoever it might
Hmm.
be, whether it's and the people on the left, people on the right, they all do it. And the consequences of that. I mean, like you say, we might be seeing that with this. I think we saw it with the Minnesota shootings a few months ago. Um, that rhetoric, when you demonize some of this language people use, is blasphemous, things like that. That's really charged language for a lot of people, and that can, and especially if you have other things. Obviously, somebody that's going
Yeah.
to go resort to that probably has other things going on in their lives, and I think we just have to really keep that in mind. That yeah, you can have your differences, but yeah, and you may not see that criticism as that, that harsh. Like you're just, oh, it's something I want to say. But, for some people, that language can mean so much.
Yes, I mean, and it goes back to what we've talked about with the partisan doom loop of sorts, to where people begin to see the other side as an enemy and as a threat, which then may justify violent action. And so I just want to reiterate what I've said on your show multiple times is the people who are engaging in this kind of rhetoric are a small minority on both sides. It does not reflect the vast majority of of Americans. But in the idea where the squeaky wheel gets the grease, the people who talk the loudest and say the most extreme things sometimes are the ones who get all the attention.
And I think another thing we repeat a lot is, you have a lot more influence with those kind of closer to your own side, whatever that might be.
Yeah.
And you can, that's where we need to sort of call some of this out and point it out because we don't have as much influence. It's easy to call out the other side and
Mhm.
they're just going to see you as another partisan person. But, people on your own side, I think you have more influence and we need to call this out when we see our own side doing this. And I'm really nervous, where this is headed. So I think we all need to step up on that and try to lower the temperature within our own the places we have influence.
Absolutely. And I think that will occur, but the question is for how long? I'm guessing
Yeah.
we'll go a week and then we'll see what happens there. To a certain extent, this can be since it's another anniversary, 9/11. I remember after the attacks, I was asked at one public gathering, do you think this is going to change our politics? And my response then was, well, I think it will do it short term, but there are still some structural factors that will lead this to eventually rise back. And that, as what we have seen, so we may see a temporary lull, but we may return. But once again, just like from 9/11, just after this and the other attacks you have talked about, maybe this is a time that we can all step back and try to actually be more proactive in doing something to try to prevent something like this occurring again.
Yeah. Yeah, I hope so. Yeah, and it's easy for it to go both ways. And I've already seen a lot of that rhetoric. Folks on both sides so far. Not everyone has really gone in that direction, and it seems like escalating. So some are trying to escalate things
Yeah,
even more,
yeah,
and that's very discouraging.
yeah. For what I've seen on my social media, there have been a lot of people express uh, outrage over the murder, which is appropriate. Uh, but I also saw one person this morning post something about this means war. The other side views us as a threat. And so we can't live peacefully with each other. One side's going to have to win. And that's the kind of thinking that gets us in trouble.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Well, it was about a year ago that we were all sitting around we had an election coming up, big election coming up. There was a lot of there were a lot of concerns and fears and and so we had an episode where we tried to maybe do some grounding around that, like what were some of these threats. And we obviously couldn't cover everything in Agenda
Sure.
47 or Project 2025 then, and we're not going to be able to cover everything going on now either. But we picked out three things to talk about a little bit. One was impoundment power, one was Schedule F and related to civil service, and another one was weaponization of the DOJ. And then, as you note, we also talked a little bit about the doom loop and how to sort of maybe keep a perspective on that. So, I want to talk a little bit about each of those, and then I want to also talk about some new things that are kind of on people's minds now. We have election legitimacy questions, fears about the midterms and beyond. We have sort of what's happening at the judicial level, and I think we have to keep that in perspective as to where that really sits. And then some. There's been questions about free press. There are other questions as well, but I thought I'd choose those to start with. So where we talked before, we talked about that, there'd be pressure from the courts and regarding impoundment power, there'd be pressure from the courts and um, there's the Impoundment Control Act and so 1 year later, where do we stand on all that? Have it seems like we haven't seen a lot of definitive finals on some of these cases. I think that's something we have to realize. A lot of this stuff has not
Yeah.
run through the courts yet.
Yeah. And I think that's what we need to be thinking about with a lot of this is that it's going to take a time. Our courts are reactive institutions. They cannot go looking for things. They have to wait for cases to be brought to them. And once a district court decides that takes a while, it goes to the appellate court, then it goes to the Supreme Court. So part of what I would tell everyone thinking about this is there are a lot of things that I find disturbing that Trump is trying to do. But what I would also suggest is that we need to have the proper time perspective on this. So I think since it's college football season, one of my favorite times, let me give a football analogy. We're in the first quarter of a fourth quarter of a four-quarter game. And so what we have seen is that Trump has been very aggressive. He has, it's not just the aggressiveness, it's the breadth of the aggressiveness which has surprised me. And he has notched up some wins. He has intimidated his own party. The other party is struggling to find its footing on things. And so it's like he has scored a couple of quick touchdowns, and some fans going, oh, the game's over. Well, the simple fact is there's going to be time for people to adjust their defense, their offense, and we still have quite a bit of time to go. And so when we are looking at this, we have to remember this is a political process and that politics and political time is a little bit different from what our regular time, what we would like for it to be. So courts, it takes them a while to deal with things and for it to get all the way up there. What we also see is that Trump is still popular with his base, which continues to cower congressional Republicans. But what we see coming on is economic news is not looking as good. Well, we could potentially see some more decline in Trump's approval, which then may embolden people who are opposed to him, who have been quiet, to start speaking up. It could also mean that the Supreme Court, I think, at times might be acting strategically because he at times is threatening courts. Well, we'll see if I will abide by that. But yes, I will abide, to where they may be thinking we have to choose when we can and can't act. And we're going to delay things until we're in a better position to act, because a lot of what the rulings have been that Trump has won has been on issues of standing. Who is the appropriate person to bring a lawsuit, but not on the actual substance of what he is doing. And so, if you look at it from that perspective, it is possible that the Supreme Court just trying to wait until it's a more opportune time to make certain decisions. Of course, they're going to agree with Trump on some uh, issues. We shouldn't expect Trump to go over with the Supreme Court. The question is, which ones are they going to agree with him with, and which ones are he will they say his power play has gone too far?
Well, I mean, one of the effects of that is that in the meantime, he's doing it and nothing's stopping him. And specifically with the impoundment, what are some examples of places where he's held back money so far?
Okay, so in this way, he's really been strategic in how he is doing this, or maybe I should say Russell Watt, the director of OMB, has been very strategic. If you look at the money he's focusing on the most, a lot of it is foreign aid, because foreign aid does not have much of a domestic political constituency. So the idea is he's taking something that people are less likely to fight for. And if he sets the precedent for doing that, then the idea is he can potentially not spend money in other areas. And so that's kind of the political aspect of, I'm doing something which it's easier for me to get away with, to set a precedent for future use. But what you do see is that when he is doing this, you are having some Republicans speak up. And it's people like Susan Collins of Maine, the chair of the Appropriations Committee, Tom Tillis, now that he has announced that he's not running for re-election, is saying he's very leery of this. And there are other members of the Appropriations Committees in both the House and Senate who say, hey, we're working hard to do something here. We don't like the fact that you're trying to take away our power. And so you have to remember, these people may feel like they support Trump or feel like they have to support Trump, but they're in Congress for a reason. And if there's no reason for them to be in Congress because they defer to the executive all the time, then they will either leave, or eventually they're going to start to push back. And we see some green shoots of pushing back on the Republican side. And remember, there's a 2-seat majority in the House, 3-seat majority in the Senate. It doesn't take that many people to kind of team with Democrats to potentially push back on Trump's impoundment power. Plus, these cases still haven't reached the Supreme Court. And that's where I think the Supreme Court is going to be skeptical. So if we look at the Supreme Court, they tend to support what's called the unitary theory of the executive. This was created by conservatives in the 70s and 80s when they may control the presidency, like with Reagan, but they couldn't control Congress to push back against the administrative state. So they came up with this idea that the president, that all executive authority is vested in the president, so everyone in the executive branch must do as he wants. We've seen the Supreme Court say at times that we agree with this, for example, in his firing of Democratic members of independent regulatory agencies. And so what we can see is that it's possible the Supreme Court will say the president can command the executive branch, but that's different from saying the president commands the government. And when Congress says in an appropriations bill, you shall spend, then the president is doing something contrary to Congress and something that the executive branch signed off on. And I think you're going to find a very skeptical Supreme Court about that kind of power.
Yeah. Well, I guess time will tell, as you say.
Yeah, well, I mean, and that's what a lot of this involves is time will tell.
Yeah. So another thing we talked about was Schedule F, and it's just in general, kind of this, sort of gutting the civil service, which was it has been part of was in Project 2025. They sort of call it the administrative state, and they think it was, you know, uh, had too much power. And so
Mhm.
Schedule F has been revived. We talked about that there would be practical limitations. It might be hard to find enough loyalists, and there would obviously be legal challenges as well. And I know that that's true that there have been challenges, but he certainly has gotten rid of. He has reclassified people, and he has closed down and gotten rid of a lot of people in the bureaucracy.
Yeah, so I think about 10% of the federal bureaucracy has left or been fired. And so that and he has targeted certain agencies which he thinks are uh, in opposition to his views. And so he's going after certain agencies. And so that's a problem because these agencies still have statutory authority to do something. And if you reduce them too much, they may not be able to do that. But by the same token, does the president potentially have the right to say, I can do this with fewer people? Potentially, there is an argument that can be made for that. But what we have to think about is not just the idea of what you um, have said that he's um, getting rid of people. It's what's going to be the consequences of this. What I'm most concerned with at this point is how the DNI Tulsi Gabbard is basically gutting the intelligence community of people who have any views contrary to the administration bottom line. That is a big problem because the job of a president's advisors is to give him the information he needs to make the best decision. And what we see is that Gabbard's going about trying to make sure that there's no one there to deliver a dissenting opinion, which means Trump is likely to make bad decisions. And if he makes bad decisions, that's potentially bad for the nation. But what you also have to remember is that's bad for Trump because if the government's incompetent, he can't blame anybody else for it. He owns it lock, stock, and barrel now, and that's going to lead to political pushback from within his party, or potentially make it easier for Democrats to win seats in the midterms to put more pressure on him if they take one or both chambers of Congress. So while he's doing some things, I think many of these things will backfire. It's not just he's getting rid of people in the intelligence apparatus. He's surrounding himself with yes men, and that's going to backfire against him eventually. And that's when you'll start seeing pushback occur more and more when people say, you're responsible for the problems we're facing.
Yeah, I mean, it's yeah, well, a bunch of things come to mind there. One is, of course, these things can take a long time. You know, if the train conductor jumps off the train or the train engineer or something jumps off the train, it still goes for a while, but eventually there's going to be consequences from that. And I feel like a lot of this is that kind of thing. Like we may not see some of these consequences for a while. I think that's true in Health and Human Services and the CDC and so on as well. Um, you know, and another thing that comes to mind specifically about intelligence is, you know, the world's not any less dangerous than it was, you know,
Right.
2 years ago or whatever.
Right.
It's a dangerous world out there, and that's pretty scary when you start, you know, eliminating the competence.
Yeah, and we see right now, if you saw the meeting in Beijing with uh, President Xi, President Putin, Prime Minister Modi of India, China's actually taken advantage of Trump's alienating a good portion of the world to try to bring more people on his side. And Trump's not seeing this because it doesn't fit with his worldview. And that's part of the problem and why he needs to be surrounded by people, or at least have people giving people who have access to him the information he needs to make good decisions.
Yeah, otherwise you sort of have a North Korea type situation.
Yeah.
Emperor has no clothes kind of thing, I guess. Yeah, so let's talk. So I guess where do we? I know there are a lot of cases. I don't think any have been completely settled. Have any been settled at the Supreme Court level regarding the civil service firings and some of the challenges from the
Um,
unions?
I don't think it's made it there. I know the firings of members of regulatory agencies the Supreme Court has allowed to occur on the shadow docket, which is their hint to, yeah, we're going to agree with this. But but they still haven't made a final decision on most cases.
Yeah, so it's kind of leaning to where he'll probably be allowed to do this.
To do some of the things, yes.
Yeah. Well, I want to make sure we talk about this a little bit because I think it's one of the areas where I think we both have some concerns in terms of. I mean, I kind of even am reluctant to use the term weaponization of the DOJ, but there's certainly questions about independence of the DOJ for sure. And that's something that one of the things that concerns me about this the most is that, you know, there's not even you know, a pretense. I mean, people can argue that previous administrations were interfering or, you know, there wasn't an adequate independence and things like that. But in this case, they at least didn't sort of say that publicly. Like, you know, they would at least say, oh, no, the DOJ is independent and the FBI is independent and this kind of thing. But with this administration, they're sort of saying, no, they're not independent. I'm going to tell them exactly what to do. And I run all those things now. I mean, because he's almost pretty much said that, I think. But you can tell me if I've got that wrong. And that the thing that, you know, and so that sets a precedent for me that I'm very concerned about, that that's the new normal. Um, and we talked before, we were kind of telling people that there would be practical checks, and I think many of these are still there. I
Mhm.
think they have been softened though, and we talked about grand juries. I think that's a big one. We talked about skeptical prosecutors. I think that's still happening, although you're seeing people resign. And I think there is the media and public scrutiny. I think that's been greatly weakened though. So I'll just let you sort of pick up with all that.
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing I say is you're right that there has been political attorney generals in the past. I mean, it used to be the idea that a president would choose a best friend to be the attorney general so that they wouldn't cause them any trouble. And even we've got like JFK appointing his brother, Nixon appointing his campaign manager, John Mitchell. But what is different is that Trump is being clear that he wants certain things to occur. And I think that goes too far for this reason, because one, the power of the United States government to prosecute people is an awesome power. And while there are many people who Trump may target, um, many of these people are well-known people. They have access to money, to getting legal defense funds to help cover their costs. So I'm less concerned about people like the John Boltons and some of these others. But it's the lower level people who do not have the financial resources and do not have the access to the financial resources. And so the idea is the government has unlimited resources and they can draw out an investigation for a long time to wear out your resources to potentially get you to cop to something minor so they can claim a scalp of sorts. And so I think that's the problem. It's also the problem of he's intentionally trying to intimidate his opponents. I think what is it? Teddy Roosevelt talked about. He had a bully pulpit. The idea is the office of the presidency offers me a platform to go convince the public to pressure Congress to support my laws. We've moved from the bully pulpit to the bully president, where Trump tries to coerce his opponents, whether it's through tariffs, whether it's through threats to law firms of you'll lose governmental business if you hire A. And he tries to intimidate people through threats of firing of Federal Reserve members to get them to lower the interest rates, threaten primaries against Republicans if they speak out against him. He's trying to bully everyone so that he is going to be able to accomplish his goals. And when someone has that kind of power and puts the Department of Justice behind that, that is a threat to all of us.
Yeah, for sure. And and I think we often forget how important, one aspect of it's an ideal, like we don't always achieve it, but this idea that we're equal under the law is such a
Mhm.
huge part of our democracy and why this works, or our republic. Um, and once you don't have that anymore, which we never have it 100%, but that was always an ideal that we strove for, that we had that. And like you say, you get this unequal weight when you sort of got the federal government on one side and all the rest of us on the other side.
Yeah, and and while we've seen like the U.S. Attorney for D.C. Miss Bureau tried to get these harsh charges against the person who threw the subway sandwich the grand jury has rejected. But what we have also seen is that some people are hearing what Trump is saying and they're trying to work with him. A perfect example of this is, I think his name is Bill Schulte. He's head of the Housing Authority. And he's basically going through mortgage applications of Trump opponents and leaking information that, hey, this person did something wrong. So you've got people who are going through trying to do the president's bidding and finding information that he could use, which he has said, based on this, I'm firing Lisa Cook from the Federal Reserve for cause. But the fact that he's doing this solely against uh, Trump's opponents, when the press has found out that other Republicans have done the same thing, that is very problematic. I mean, that's when a government is truly weaponized against its opponents.
Yeah, and we talked about that before, kind of the selective prosecutions and things like that, which is difficult. There's not a lot you can do about that other than winning those cases, which is
Well,
expensive and a lot of resources.
it's not just selective prosecutions; it's selective
Yeah,
investigations.
yeah, yeah,
They're they are not finding crimes and trying to find out who committed them. They're finding people and trying to find a crime that they have committed. that's a completely different scenario.
Yeah, and we talked about the idea of like a career prosecutor would probably push back from that, or a career FBI person would push back from it. But they're finding these people that are willing to go do that.
Yeah. Uh, well, they're finding some
Right. They're finding some.
who are willing to do this. But what we have also seen is that many times when they can't, when the career people don't do it, they put their own person in. And what we see is they make very bad legal arguments, which makes it easier for the judges to reject.
Yeah.
And so I think as some of these come forward, judges are going to be very skeptical of these prosecutions.
But as we were talking about a little bit before, there still is this kind of second order effect kind of thing
Mhm.
where people are reluctant, oh, I'm not going to get involved in these things because I might be a target.
Yes, and that is the threat, and that's especially the threat for the lower level people.
Yeah. Well, yeah, so what's our rating on how well our institutions are holding up in this case? I mean, it's there's always a challenge, with the old saying about, you kind of can't regulate morality kind of thing. I mean, you have to do some of this with norms. You can't do everything with laws, but rule of law, and as you say, the power of the entire federal government is huge.
Yeah. So I mean, so as a professor, I'm going to say the grade is incomplete because we don't really know. So, for example, looking at lawsuits, if the AP tracks what's going on with this, and what we have seen is that 132 executive actions have been blocked by the courts partially or fully, while 85 have been left in effect. So, and then there is another 85 that are pending. So I think what we are seeing is that Trump is losing about 60% of the cases. So I think that shows that the courts are being an effective um, restraint on him. Congress has completely failed. They get a big zero from me because the Republican Congress has been spineless because they are afraid what their base will say. And so they have failed the job. I think the Democratic Party is not doing great. They still can't believe they've lost, and they still haven't figured out what the problem is. They seem to think, oh, we need to get rid of the old people and replace them with young people. Okay, that's fine, but that doesn't deal with the problem they have is that they are out of touch on quite a few issues, just like the Republicans are out of touch on quite a few issues. And we don't see them saying we need to pivot and change our policies on this. Instead, they're doubling down in instances. The press is still holding him accountable. I mean, he's threatening them, but they're still reporting against him, and they're still reporting things that he doesn't want to hear. I think you see what CBS they settled the suit. They've talked about bringing in Barry Weiss into CBS News, but is that a means of realizing they need to be more reflective of the public, or because they're going to stop saying negative things about Trump? And I think as long as Trump is doing things that are questionable, the press is still going to let people hear that. Now, has Fox News failed? Has um, Newsmax failed? And some others, yes. But I'd also say some of the mainstream media have failed because they also assume if Trump does it, it's wrong. And not everything he does is wrong, and not everything he does is a threat. Um, and so states, I think the states are rather effective in pushing back, especially the attorney generals. They are behind a lot of these lawsuits, and they're having success there. So, not all of our institutions are working as we would like, but the system as a whole is strained, but it's holding. Now, this can change, but right now, I still remain optimistic that the system will work and that we're still early in the first quarter. Halftime's coming up at the midterm elections, and we'll see if the people push back at that point.
Yeah, so that raises a couple of questions we definitely want to touch on as to what the, kind of prospectively, what are people concerned about? And it touches on both the election question and it also touches on the media question. And what's your take on, do you think the media has softened, has reacted to that pressure somewhat and is more reluctant to sort of push back? Or do you think that they're still doing it in about the same way?
What I have seen in the media that I read is they're still willing to push back on what they see as actions that go too far or they believe as threatening democracy. What I see the media changing a bit on is they're less focusing on some of the progressive agenda. They're not pushing it as much as they have in the past. And so I see that they kind of corrected and thinking, okay, we went too far on some of these progressive social issues. Let's kind of move a little bit more to the center. But when it comes to the their perceived abuse of power of Trump, I don't really see them uh, reducing their coverage or not not covering it and calling it as they see it.
Hmm. I guess I'll drop a little commentary in here too, because you mentioned, sort of the Congress getting an F, getting a failing grade, and some about the Democrats too. And I would say that, that's been ongoing for a while. I mean, the Democrats are as guilty of that, prior to Trump, as anybody, as sort of relinquishing their powers. But I think also with the Democrats, you were talking about sort of, they don't seem to have figured out what their next step is in some way and doubling down. I think the biggest thing to me, that's still concerning with them is they seem to just be doubling down on the same idea that we'll just continue with this Trump is bad, Republicans are bad strategy. And people are definitely looking for more than that.
Yes, yes. I mean, and there are some people in the Democratic Party who are trying to talk more about policy change, but it's not getting the traction among the activists who are many times they're just fueled by a hatred for all things Trump.
Right. And I think that's a place that's probably, you talked about the media kind of softening on some of that, the cultural stuff. That's actually in some ways probably a good thing. Um, you know,
Yeah.
I think obviously there's room for those kind of conversations about gay marriage and other things. But I think that focus, I think, can be, um, it can it can drive division in areas where it's probably not particularly productive, right? And I think that
Well,
leaves us where we are to some degree.
yeah, I mean, and it furthers distrust of institutions because if you're on the other side, or even if you're in the middle and you see yourself being called a bigot or racist because you don't believe certain things, then you're going to be less likely to believe the other things that they report. And so I think this is something that all our institutions need to realize and start making changes about is what can they do without undermining their mission to reestablish trust with larger members of the public.
Yeah, and I think that's also true of the you were talking about how it's kind of like everything Trump does is bad, and that also lowers that credibility. That you're not focusing on the areas where there's probably more agreement that it's bad. There's
Right.
more consensus on that. It starts to look partisan. Um, yeah, so let's talk a little bit. So I think it's on a lot of people's minds about, election interference or whatever other ways there can be, maybe ways to influence the election that maybe are either extra legal or certainly outside of norms. Um, Certainly, a lot of people, sort of believe that it's going to that I don't know exactly what a free and fair elections even means exactly, but they're sort of suggesting that yeah, I mean, if Trump could have his way, he probably would influence the election, right?
Yeah.
But how effective do you think these things will be? How what's your rating or idea that sort of? And I'm concerned
Okay.
about people feeling like the election won't be legitimate. That creates a whole nother, sort of downward spiral. So yeah, what have you got for us on that?
Well, I think when we're looking at a lot of his executive orders about mail-in voting, voter ID, they're dead on arrival because the Constitution is clear that states run elections. And so these executive orders are simply Donald Trump performing for his base. It's there to make them think he's doing something when he has zero power to do it. I think part of the larger problem we see is what is going on with the redistricting, where Trump says he's entitled to five more districts in Texas. I think the Missouri House passed something to eliminate another district there. And of course, in California, where you are, you're voting on something to allow the Democrats to redistrict even more to counteract those five seats that Texas is trying to occur. And so I, I think that's problematic with this for everybody. I mean, what we have to realize is that gerrymandering goes back to the 1820s. We have to remember that both sides do it. We see that even when there are independent commissions, like in California, they can be manipulated to advance one party. And uh, that's the problem because the technology exists today for us to draw districts to where we're almost guaranteed to know what the outcome will be. So that's problematic. What I also say is just because they redistrict doesn't mean they're going to gain seats. Because if you look at what they're doing in Texas, a lot of the districts there they have been changing are in South Texas, which have large Latino populations. And it's based on the fact that Trump and Republicans will get the percent of Latino support that they get in 2026 that they got in 2024. I would still say Latinos are a swing group and they can swing the other way. And those five seats they pick up could mean that you're going to lose that they might not gain all those seats. And when you take Republicans away from other seats, they may go from plus 20 to plus 10. That means in a wave, those seats can go the other way too. So I think I don't like what they're doing with these with these mid-decade redistricting. I think we need to do more things about redistricting to make it more fair. But I'm not convinced that it's going to guarantee that Republicans will keep the House. And with uh, some Republicans in the Senate being vulnerable due to open seats and other things, I think it's possible that Democrats, I don't think they can get 51 seats, but they can get 50 seats. It would still be difficult for them to do. But I think if Trump is Trump, I think I've told you before, Trump's superpower is self-destruction. Um, that he can do things that are going to backfire on him and will backfire on the Republican Party, which will help Democrats gain at least one chamber in the 2026 midterms, despite what Texas and Missouri and potentially Indiana are trying to do.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of different analyses of this redistricting landscape and what, and predictions about how it might go and stuff. Yeah, and it's hard to get a good sense of it. I've seen analysis that kind of contradicts itself or contradict each other. So it's hard. I wrote a piece about it saying I don't support California jumping in, adding to the escalation of this arms race. And I'm sure it's not a particularly popular perspective, but I think for exactly the reasons you're talking about. I mean, I'd rather see more, you know, like find out what's wrong with the independent, like let's go work on that side. Like we already have this independent commission. Let's work on improving that to make it more effective, that kind of thing. And the other thing I sort of think about this that I didn't say in my piece, but I think about it is that sort of like Democrats win the election, then you won't have to worry about redistricting. Go be popular, and then go get votes, and you won't have to worry about redistricting. Go
Yeah,
win
so
over the
so I
people,
mean,
right?
yeah, I'll throw this out. I saw some polling, I think I read yeah yesterday, that independents are moving in against Trump. They're upset about a lot of the things he's doing, but here's the problem. Independents are more upset at Democrats.
Right.
As I've said before, we've got two minority parties trying to impose an unpopular ideological agenda on the nation. And when you do that, you should expect the public to punish you in the elections. I'm expecting the Republicans to at least lose the House in 2026, regardless of what they do with redistricting.
So you're pretty optimistic that the elections will be legitimate.
Yeah. So
You know,
I mean, so it's how do we find legitimacy? I think the people who want to vote and are eligible to vote will be able to vote. The concerns about legitimacy is not at the micro level, at the individual vote level or the individual district level. It's at the macro level to where we think that the system is rigged against us, whoever us are in independence, the left, the right, to where we have less trust in the system. So it's a macro level problem more than it is a micro level problem.
so you're pretty confident votes will be cast and votes will be counted.
Yes.
Even because some people, talking about federalizing, would he have any success in, I don't know, the Insurrection Act or using some other emergency power to somehow federalize elections?
The No, he's got courts will stop that ASAP if he tries to use the Insurrection Act to change voting. The Constitution is clear. States are responsible for elections. The only way that the Constitution authorizes um, the federal government to step in is if they're trying to deny minorities the right to vote under the 15th Amendment.
So I guess that kind of overlaps a little bit with the doom loop conversation and and we've already talked a little bit about the sort of, I guess, scorecard for judicial restraint and how the judicial is holding up. I think you're giving it reasonably good ratings so far.
Well, so far, I mean, it's still incomplete because SCOTUS hasn't made any of these major rulings yet. I think when they start making substantive rulings, that's when we'll have a better idea about what the scorecard will be.
Yeah, and I spoke with a constitutional scholar about, talking about kind of the doom loop scenario kind of stuff. That if if it comes to a head between sort of the executive branch, and if Trump really does start ignoring orders on the regular and important orders, and sort of move down that authoritarian path even more so, what might that look like? And it's kind of like they described it as kind of two suns colliding, because you sort of have this judicial branch which has power, but the executive does the enforcement. If nobody wants to enforce, and they were talking about how that it's likely that John Roberts is reluctant to do things like contempt charges, because he kind of leads down that potential suns colliding kind of scenario, where if they did start to ignore those, then he's got to do something, and that do something can get pretty ugly.
Well, and I think while Alexander Hamilton is right that the courts are the least dangerous branch, they have neither the power of the purse nor the sword. What we also have to remember is the court's biggest power is public opinion. And I think if they ruled something unconstitutional, there there would be the left, the middle, and a good portion of the right that would push back and almost force him to comply. I know the Supreme Court's public approval ratings are not great, but they're the highest of three branches. And I think it still has a reservoir of support, though, with what Trump has been saying, he's trying to undermine that a bit. But the other thing to remember is he appointed three members of the court. So it's hard for him to say it's a biased court against him.
Right. Yeah. Well, he still says a lot of stuff.
Yeah, well, yes, he does say a lot of stuff that's nonsense, and too many people believe the nonsense.
Well, so let's.
But
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
but the same thing is, if there's enough pushback, he will give in.
Yeah, I mean, so that's, I guess, another question some people have too, is like I'm always encouraged when I see him back down, because at least that means he's still paying attention to something, whatever he might be backing down a little bit from, because at least it shows he's not just, completely just doesn't care anymore, which is a concern a lot of people have. I mean, so how the put you still feel that he I mean, at least I will say a positive to me is, even if they do sometimes violate the law, they're at least not violate the law, but like violate a court order in some way. One could argue that they are, let's say, they're still usually making some kind of argument how they're not violating the court order. You know what I mean? So at least they care about the perception of whether they're violating court orders, whereas it could be the other way around, where they can do, yeah, we're violating it and we're going to continue to violate it. Do what you want to do. They haven't gone that far yet.
Yeah, I kind of explain Trump's relationship with court orders as it's like a parent who tells their child to go clean up their room and they don't want to. They do it, but begrudgingly and slowly, and it takes them a while. And that's kind of the way that the Trump administration responds to these court orders, but they're also appealing them. And so when we're looking at defining a court order, we have to also separate between define an order that is under appeal. So it's not a final decision yet. And so I think, and that might be what the constitutional scholar you talked to said, was it's not defining federal courts that matters as much, defying in air quotes. It's whether he literally defies the Supreme Court.
Hmm. Right. Um, okay, so let's wrap up a little bit with, we've already, I won't go through, the institutions and which ones are showing resilience, because we sort of touched on that already. What do you think, citizens can do, beyond elections? I mean, we have to be, there has to be something we can do between elections to support, these democratic norms. What advice do you have for people?
Okay, so I mean, my advice is that civic virtue requires all people to be concerned about their democracy and work to protect it. So there are things that you can do. You can contact your elected official. What we've talked about earlier in the show, you can police members of your own side. When they say something extreme or they say something false, call them out on it. You can find more objective news sources about what's going on. So try to find those or read from multiple perspectives, and then you'll be able to see what they have in common on facts to figure out what is actually true. I think part of this is if you're really concerned about some of the things the Trump administration is doing, there are groups fighting it. You can donate to those groups. What I'd also say is if you do the everyday work of life, trying to make things better for yourself, your family, your community, that's part of citizenship. So you may think I can't do something about Trump, but I can do something about homelessness, sex trafficking, or something like that. Give to that local nonprofit, volunteer for that local nonprofit. That helps you make connections with other people. That strengthens what we call social capital, which is key to the success of a democracy. So, what I'd say on one level is never underestimate the regular things you do as making our democracy work. But also remember when you are engaging in others for work that benefits the community, that is also important. You're helping your community, you're building ties with others. You may learn different perspectives. You may be able to talk to others about ideas and get clarification, or maybe pull them from the dark side of whichever they're at. Other things that you can do if you're a social media influencer is just try to present information that is contrary to the partisan narratives, and uh, to try to point out some of the positive things going on. Don't always get concerned about the negative. I think when we talked last year, I said be more focused on the probable instead of the possible, because that possible may never happen, may never happen. Focus on the things that are more likely to happen instead of what may happen 10, 20 years from now, though you should still be concerned about that.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. I mean, don't underestimate the value of raising good children.
Yes,
You don't have to necessarily be out there waving a sign somewhere.
exactly.
So, and so that's a great finishing point, but it does bring up this issue of thinking about the longer term, right? I mean, I think, one of the challenges some of us have thinking about longer term is that kind of in the meantime, challenge, right?
Mhm.
That especially if things are running through the courts and in the meantime, certain people now are maybe suffering in some way, until this gets settled one way or the other. What's some good strategy for sort of thinking about that?
Yeah, so I'm one who doesn't think Trump is an authoritarian, but I think what he is doing is he is weakening the norms that restrain pre pre presidents. And so I'm concerned about who becomes president in 10, 20 years.
Hmm.
And so I think what we have to hope for is that both parties will begin to see that this is a problem, and that when we have a change of administrations or things, that we can put more legal restrictions on what a president can and can't do. I think something that would be easy pickings would be something like defining what an emergency is to limit presidents declaring emergencies. And so I think what we need to be thinking about is what are ways that we can shore up the institutions so that these norms can be restored or strengthened in ways that we can constrain future potential authoritarian leaders.
And you'd think with how much sort of bullying the and Republicans in Congress are suffering, they would see that as like, yeah, that's probably something we should do, so we don't get bullied like this in the future.
Yeah, well, which if you took a secret vote, it would pass just like that. But since Trump has such control of the base, they are afraid to do that. Now, the good news, if you want to look at it this way, is that Trump is so generous. There's no one like him. J.D. Vance or Marco Rubio will not have the pull over the base like Donald Trump has. And I think that's when you may be able to see Republicans teaming with Democrats to put some constraints on the president. But while hopefully also both parties move toward the middle, that could also be very useful at the same time, to where there will be more people within the party to push back against the extremes.
Hmm. Yeah, another political scientist that I speak to frequently is Kevin Smith, and yeah, he always says Congress could make a law. He's like, stop complaining. You're in Congress. You could make a
Yeah,
law.
exactly. Yes. That's why I say they get an F.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny that all these, this social media sometimes that's just in my head all the time when I'm seeing the social media posts from the members of Congress going, "You could make a law." It's like it's so true. Well, Dr. Evans, thank you so much for giving us your time again and giving us those insights. I really think that's some great advice about thinking about longer term and focusing locally and remembering we can't necessarily all jump into Congress and fix that overnight, but these things we do in our communities really matter.
Thank you for having me.